Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IU's B.28 Virtual Side Event on the draft evaluation policy for the Green Climate Fund. Archie, next slide, please. Thank you. My name is Asha Warsame, and I will serve as moderator for this event. And this event will feature speakers from both the IU and the GCF Secretariat. As you may know, the board has asked the IU to develop the draft evaluation policy for the Green Climate Fund. This draft has been developed by the IU in collaboration with the GCF Secretariat and in consultation with other stakeholders, and is now available on the GCF website ahead of B28. The IU and the Secretariat have worked closely together to jointly clarify and delineate the roles, responsibility, and accountabilities in this draft evaluation policy, which sets out the fund's overall approach to evaluations and identifies the main types of evaluations to be conducted within the GCF. It also sets out the roles and responsibilities of stakeholders in relation to these evaluations. This B28 side event will last for 1 hour and will include a short welcome and introduction by Andreas Reumann, Head AI of the Independent Evaluation Unit, Dr. Archi Rastogi, Evaluation Specialist at the IU, and Vladislav Arnaoudov, a Climate Change Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist at the Office of Portfolio Management at the GCF Secretariat. And together, Vlad and Archie will give us a more in-depth overview of the draft policy and its scope and implications. I welcome you to write your questions in the chat box, but you may also raise your hand and I will give you the floor to ask any questions after the presentation. Thank you, and now over to Andreas.
Thank you, Asha. Also from me, a very welcome to this IU board side event on the GCF evaluation policy. I'm glad that this event features both the GCF Secretariat and the IU. So once again, my name is Andreas Reumann. I'm head ad interim of the IU. And before we start this joint presentation by the Secretariat and the IU on this policy, I wanted to introduce you briefly to the background of this policy. So let's start. Starting with the decision in B06-09, the TOR of the IU provides that the IU will be responsible for the development and the updating of the evaluation policy of the fund. Following this, at B19, the board further stated that the IU is to prepare the evaluation policy for the board's consideration. With the decision at B24, so B24/15, the board amended the TOR of the head of the IU, reflecting that the role would also encompass the developing and the updating of this policy. In the same decision, the board also confirmed that the IU and the Secretariat jointly clarify and delineate the roles and responsibilities and the accountabilities in the evaluation policy and request them to present the evaluation policy draft for the board's consideration. So next slide, please. With this, allow me to briefly highlight where we are in this process as of now. So early drafts of this policy were developed and shared since 2018. The draft policy was shared with the board at B21, B22, and B24. In 2020 and 2021, the IU and the Secretariat worked in close collaboration on this document, and in October 2020, a draft was shared with the board for commenting. And lastly, in February 2021, a revised draft was shared with the board in preparation for a technical session, as well as at the same time, a revised draft was shared with the accredited entities for commenting and feedback as well. So I'm glad to note that the evaluation policy document has been submitted to the board as per the provisional agenda for B28. So with this, I would like to end and move over to Archie, who will walk us through some of the steps. Over.
Thank you, Andreas. Colleagues, before you, so me and Vlad and I are going to walk you through the structure of the document that's actually submitted to the board and is the document number B2805. This document presents the draft evaluation policy for the GCF, and it has the following sections. So this draft would cover the objective and scope of the policy. It would cover the principles for evaluations, It would describe the evaluation criteria, the GCF evaluation criteria, the types of evaluations that this policy would cover and recognize. The draft then covers the institutional arrangements and roles and responsibility in relation to these evaluations, the policy implications of some of these evaluations, and this policy itself, and the evaluation budget. So Vlad and I will walk you through some of these sections, starting first with the objectives. So what are the objectives of this policy? This policy would cover the GCF's approach to evaluations, quite fundamental, but it would describe the principles, it would describe the types of evaluations. It would also describe the roles and responsibilities to undertake these various kinds of evaluations. The policy would then cover the framework. This would provide the framework for the GCF to help produce the evaluations and then use them. With these evaluations, the GCF would then be able to use high quality evidence and inform its decision making. It would also cover the budget implications of undertaking those evaluations. But overall, this policy would cover a robust evaluation function as exercised by different parts of the GCF. And this relates to a couple of things. One, to the development of an accountability mechanism. The second, a culture of learning, and also relates to dialogue within the GCF and the use of evidence the use of evidence related to these various parts. In terms of the scope of the policy, the board has stated at decision B.28 that this policy is a GCF-wide policy, that this policy will guide the board, but also the Secretariat, the IU, other independent units, which are IUs, accredited entities, AEs, national designated authorities, NDAs, and focal points, FPs. In doing so, this policy then would cover the evaluation function as is exercised by at least the IU's Secretariat and AEs, but also others in the GCF. So this policy can also actually provide guidance to other stakeholders with whom the GCF may not have a formal relationship, but may like to use this policy to see what standards the GCF has aspired to for its evaluations. The document is also quite clear that this does not cover the monitoring functions of the GCF because which are covered elsewhere in the GCF policy architecture. Now, very quickly, what are the principles for evaluations to which this policy sort of describes? So the first set of principles would relate to impartiality, objectivity, and unbiasedness. So this policy would state that that evaluations should have clear roles and responsibilities, that evaluators that are undertaking these evaluations, especially independent evaluators, are free from external influence and are free from bias also in undertaking these evaluations. The evaluations, in line with the principles laid out by the United Nations Evaluations Group, would not take an active part in the design and implementation of policies in the day-to-day management of these policies that they are evaluating. The second set of principles would relate to relevance, use, and participation. So according to this set of principles, evaluations would be relevant. They would include a plan for knowledge, for dissemination of the findings and for knowledge management. The choice and timing of evaluations would maximize the benefit for stakeholders. And the results of evaluations would then be presented to the commissioner of these evaluations. So for instance, in the case of the IU, the commissioner would be the board. And so the evaluations would be presented to the board. And the evaluations would be participatory. So the results would take into account the needs of the participants, and the recommendations would include clear roles and responsibilities. The third set of principles would relate to credibility and robustness. So this is how evaluations are conducted. The methods are state of the art. It would ensure that that methods are transparent, that the data collection is high quality, and uses predetermined protocols and approaches. So just to make sure that GCF subscribes to high standards of evaluations that are out there. And finally, the final set of principles that this policy would describe is measurability. That evaluations are able to describe, are able to measure and assess the performance of the GCF and its funded activities. Now, what are the GCF evaluation criteria then? So according to this policy, the GCF evaluation criteria would apply to all GCF evaluations, to which we'll come in a minute. And what are these evaluation criteria? So the board has, which Andreas spoke about at B0609, described the terms of reference of the IU, which cover the GCF evaluation criteria, which are as follows. So the first criteria is relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and sustainability of projects and programs. These are quite familiar to those of us who do evaluations. as the OECD DAC criteria, and the OECD DAC criteria also include a new criteria now, coherence, which is the second criteria here, which aligns very closely with the second criteria, which is coherence in the delivery of climate finance with other multilateral entities. But these evaluation criteria would then also include the following: gender equity, country ownership of projects and programs, innovativeness in results areas, and the extent to which interventions may lead to paradigm shift towards low emission and climate resilient development pathways. The next evaluation criteria would be replication and scalability. So this would examine the extent to which these activities can be scaled up in other locations within the same country or replicated in other contexts. And finally, the final evaluation criteria would be unexpected results, both positive and negative. And very quickly, before I hand it over to Vlad, what are the kinds of evaluations this policy would recognize? It would recognize 3 different types of evaluations. The first would be GCF independent evaluations. These evaluations would be conducted and managed by the IEU in accordance with the board-approved work plan of the IEU. The second type that this policy would recognize would be secretariat-led evaluations. Quite self-evidently, these would be evaluations that are managed, commissioned by the GCF Secretariat in order to fulfill its role on monitoring and evaluation. And the third kind that this policy recognizes would be AE-led evaluations. So according to the monitoring and accountability framework of the GCF, the projects are expected to undertake project interim and project final evaluations. This policy would also recognize that the AEs may conduct impact evaluations of GCF funded activities. Vlad, over to you.
Thank you, Archie. So the policy also defines clearly the roles and responsibilities of the different stakeholders and the board. And this policy is presented to the board, is to be approved by the GCF board, which will also oversee the implementation of the policy and its impact. The policy also looks at the roles of the IU, who is the custodian of this policy. It is in charge of conducting independent evaluations in the GCF, and it can also provide policy advisory and policy review. The policy looks at the role of the Secretariat in relation to evaluations, and in line with the governing instrument, the policy confirms that the monitoring and evaluation function of the GCF stays with the Secretariat. The Secretariat is also supporting capacity building, and the Secretariat will lead that in cooperation with the IU, and the Secretariat will support the provision of guidance on monitoring and reporting of data. And finally, the policy also looks at the role of AEs, which, as already mentioned, are in charge of interim and final evaluation of projects, and the policy provides further guidance on that. And if we move to the next slide, you can see that this policy, as any policy documents, have major implications on existing policies and processes. But we made sure when designing the policy that it takes into consideration the result management framework and the performance measurement frameworks of the GCF, which currently cover the result management of the fund. But also the policy takes into consideration the current draft integrated result management framework, which is also tabled in the B.28 agenda. The policy provides further guidance on the data and information needed for individual indicators to improve the overall project evaluability, and it's a very big advantage of the policy. And it also establishes evaluation criteria to apply to independent interim and final evaluations by accredited entities. Now, this is a slight deviation from what we currently have in the GCF, as the MAF allows accredited entities to apply their own evaluation criteria. But after the policy becomes effective, the evaluation criteria of the fund should be applied to all newly approved GCF projects. Also, the policy necessitates the development of standards and guidance, as well as capacity building, and the Secretariat and the IU will jointly work on this. And also the policy clarifies the budget requirements linked to evaluation. There'll be a separate slide on this. And finally, the policy provides guidance in relation to other policies linked to evaluation. And if we move to the next slide, you actually see more details of the budget implications of this policy. So in relation to the IU, the policy is considering up to 1% of the programming envelope of the GCF, and this is needed to cover the annual work program of the Independent Evaluation Unit as approved by the board. For Secretariat-led evaluations, we're looking at a budget of 1 to 2% of the approved annual administrative budget of the GCF Secretariat, and this is to cover the GCF monitoring and evaluation function as detailed in the governing instrument, including the impact evaluations prescribed in the MAF and the AMAs and portfolio management requirements. And finally, the policy is looking at A-led evaluations, and we're looking at up to 5% of the project budget that will cover monitoring and evaluative data costs and result management costs. And in this way, there is more clarity on also for ACE what to include as part of the evaluation budgets. So this is very briefly the presentation on our side. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm giving the floor back to Asha.